I never thought the two people I raised and loved with every fiber of my being would look me in the eye while I was still tethered to a hospital monitor and tell me I was no longer their responsibility, effectively abandoning me in a cold recovery room after a grueling 6-hour surgery. As I sat there, clutching my thin hospital gown and feeling the raw, searing ache in my abdomen, my son, David, and his wife, Sarah, explained with practiced indifference that their guest room had been converted into a home office, and they simply didn't have the emotional bandwidth to deal with an elderly woman in recovery. They walked out of that room without looking back, leaving me to wonder how the boy I used to tuck in at night had turned into a man who could leave his mother stranded in a hospital parking lot with nowhere to go. I'm sitting here now, finally able to breathe again, but I have to ask you all honestly. Is there ever a justification for a child to treat their parent like an expired piece of furniture? Or was I right to do what I did once the sun went down that evening? To understand how we got to that heartbreaking moment in the surgical ward, you have to understand the life I built for David. My husband passed away when David was only 7, leaving us with a mountain of debt and a small, crumbling house. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices in the early morning, waitressing during the day, and doing data entry at night, just to ensure he never felt the sting of poverty. I remember the winter of '98 when the heater broke. I slept on the floor of his room, piling every blanket we owned on him while I shivered in a thin coat, just so he wouldn't wake up cold. I skipped meals so he could have the best cleats for soccer. I wore the same pair of shoes for 5 years so he could go on his senior class trip to Europe. I wanted him to feel equal to the wealthy kids, never realizing I was raising someone who would eventually look down on the very hands that fed him. We were a team, or so I thought. When he met Sarah in college, I welcomed her with open arms, even helping them with the down payment on their first home by dipping into the very last of my meager retirement savings. I even spent my weekends painting their walls and weeding their garden while they sat on the porch sipping expensive lattes. I thought I was investing in our collective future, ensuring that as I grew older, I would have a place at their table. For the last few years, things seemed fine on the surface, though I noticed a growing coldness from Sarah. She started making comments about the clutter I brought when I visited, which were usually just small gifts for them, or how my stories about the past were draining and stuck in a different era. She would roll her eyes when I mentioned my back pain, or the difficulty I had navigating my own apartment. My home is on the 3rd floor of an old walk-up with no elevator, and as I hit 70, those 42 steps started feeling like a mountain. When I was diagnosed with a severe gallbladder issue that required immediate, invasive surgery, I didn't think twice about asking them for help with my 2-week post-op recovery. The doctor was adamant that I couldn't climb stairs or lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk for at least 20 days. They agreed during a Sunday brunch, albeit with a heavy sigh and a glance between them that should have been my first warning sign. I told them I'd pay for my own groceries and stay out of their hair, but Sarah just checked her watch and said they'd make it work for the family. The day of the surgery was a blur of fluorescent lights, the sharp, metallic smell of antiseptic, and the terrifying silence of the operating room. When I finally woke up in the recovery wing, groggy and nauseous from the anesthesia, my vision was swimming. I looked around for a familiar face, expecting to see David holding my hand like he did when he was a little boy scared of the dentist. Instead, I saw an empty chair and a nurse checking my vitals with a sympathetic, almost pitying look. It took hours for David and Sarah to show up, and when they didn't bring flowers, a change of clothes, or even a warm sweater. They brought an ultimatum. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, crossing her arms and tapping her designer heel, while David stared at the linoleum floor, as if he was trying to find a trapdoor to escape through. They told me the logistics had changed. Sarah's sister, a woman who hasn't held a job in 3 years, was moving into the guest room for a spiritual retreat, to find her inner peace. They decided it would be too much of a vibe killer to have a sick, recovering person moaning in the next room while they were trying to host meditation sessions. David finally looked up, but his eyes were empty. "Mom, you're a grown woman. You're tough. You can call an Uber to a motel, or find a short-term rental. We just can't do this right now. It's too much pressure on our marriage to have you underfoot." The betrayal felt sharper than the surgical incisions in my side. I felt the tears hot and heavy, but I refused to let them fall in front of her. I watched them walk out, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. I was stuck. The nurses were confused, the social worker was concerned, and I was deeply, profoundly humiliated. I ended up having to pay an exorbitant fee for a medical transport van to take me to a cheap, dingy motel near the highway, because I literally couldn't get up the stairs to my own home. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap lemon cleaner. The bed was lumpy, and every time the person in the room above me moved, the ceiling creaked as if it were about to cave in. As I lay in that motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the constant, rhythmic roar of the highway, the physical pain in my body was nothing compared to the icy clarity in my mind. I realized that my son wasn't the boy I raised. He was a stranger who valued his wife's sister's spiritual retreat over his own mother's life. He had watched me struggle to even sit up, and still told me to find a motel. But there was something they didn't know, something I had been planning to tell them that very weekend as a surprise. I had been keeping a secret for months, waiting for a moment of family celebration to reveal it. Before I tell you the absolute chaos that unfolded that evening when they realized their mistake and tried to crawl back, I want you to stop and think about this. I had spent 40 years sacrificing every comfort, every dream, and every penny for that man, and he left me in a hospital bed because I was inconvenient to his lifestyle. Before I reveal what happened when the sun went down and the phone calls started pouring in, please pause and comment below. Would you have forgiven them if they said they were sorry? Or would you have done exactly what I did? I really need to know if I'm the villain here for what comes next. By 6 p.m., I was settled in the motel, fueled by a mix of heavy painkillers and a cold, hard rage I hadn't felt in decades. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers trembling slightly from the weakness, and did what I should have done years ago. You see, the meager retirement I mentioned earlier wasn't the only thing I had. My late husband had owned a small, neglected plot of land in a rural county that everyone, including David, thought was worthless scrubland. David used to joke that we should just stop paying the taxes on it and let the state take it. But 2 months ago, a major commercial developer contacted me. That worthless land sat right in the path of a new luxury shopping complex and a high-end residential bypass. I had already signed the final papers, and the first installment of the payout, a life-changing 7-figure sum of money, had cleared into my secondary account that very morning while I was in surgery. I had originally planned to use a large chunk of it to pay off David's massive mortgage, buy them a new car, and set up a massive trust fund for the grandchildren I hoped they would eventually have. I wanted to be the grandmother who could provide everything. But as I sat in that dim motel room, eating a lukewarm sandwich from a vending machine, I realized that David and Sarah didn't want me. They only wanted what I could provide until I became a burden. They wanted the bank of mom, but they didn't want the person attached to it. That evening, around 8 p.m., my phone started blowing up. It was David, then Sarah, then David again. I ignored the first 10 calls. I watched the screen glow in the dark room, feeling a strange sense of power. Finally, I picked up. David's voice was frantic, a complete 180 from the cold, dismissive tone he had used in the hospital. "Mom, where are you? We went to your apartment to drop off some of your things we found in our car, but the neighbors said you weren't there. We went back to the hospital, and they said you left in a medical van. Why didn't you tell us?" I stayed silent for a long moment, letting the sound of the highway traffic fill the line, a stark reminder of where they had sent me. I told him calmly that I was exactly where he told me to be, out of his way. Then Sarah got on the phone, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Mother, we were just so stressed earlier. We've cleared the room out. My sister is going to stay on the couch. We're coming to get you right now. Just send the address. Also, we got a call from a lawyer's office. They were looking for you and mentioned something about a land sale and a massive deposit. Is that real? Is there really that much money?" The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. They hadn't come to their senses because they loved me. They hadn't felt a sudden pang of guilt about leaving a post-op 70-year-old in a parking lot. They had come to their senses because they found the legal notice I'd accidentally left on their kitchen table during my last visit. A notice regarding the finalization of the sale and the estimated tax implications of the millions involved. They weren't looking for a mother, they were looking for their meal ticket. They were probably already mentally spending the money on a new Tesla or a vacation to the Maldives. I felt a grim smile spread across my face. I told them that the spiritual retreat Sarah's sister wanted sounded like a great idea, and that they should definitely focus on their emotional bandwidth, because they were going to need it to handle the upcoming months. I informed them right then and there that I had contacted my lawyer from the motel bed, and instructed him to move the entirety of the funds into a private charitable foundation for single mothers and low-income elderly housing. Not a single cent would ever touch their hands. David started crying, actual sobbing, pleading that they were just overwhelmed, and that family shouldn't be this vindictive. But I reminded him that family also shouldn't leave their mother in a motel after surgery. I told him he was right about one thing. I am a grown woman and I'm tough. Tough enough to realize I'm better off without them. I hung up the phone while Sarah was still screaming in the background about how unfair it was to tease them with a fortune only to take it away. I spent the rest of the night booking a first-class, month-long recuperation stay at a high-end wellness resort, where I would have 24-hour private nursing care, gourmet meals, and a view of the ocean. The cost was astronomical, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the price. I was finally spending my money on the one person who had always looked out for me, myself. In the weeks that followed, they tried everything to get back into my good graces. They sent long, rambling emails about how the stress of the modern world made them snap. They sent flowers to my apartment that I never saw because I wasn't there. They even had David's cousins call me to tell me I was being cruel to my only son. But the bridge wasn't just burned. It was vaporized and the ashes were scattered at sea. I learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between family by blood and family by action. I've decided to sell my apartment and move to a luxury senior community in Florida, where I have friends who actually value my presence and my stories, not my bank account or what I can do for them. I'm spending my days in physical therapy, getting stronger, and my nights watching the sunset with people who would never dream of leaving someone behind. The moral of this story is that you cannot buy love, but you can certainly find out exactly how much your family thinks you're worth when the money is on the line. They showed me their price, and it was lower than the cost of a motel room. If you think I was right to cut them off and use that money to help people who actually deserve a second chance, please like this video. It's been a long, painful road to recovery, both physically and emotionally, and seeing your support means the world to me. Subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself when the people you love most let you down. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far by giving the money to charity, or did they get exactly what they deserved for their greed? I'll see you all in the next story.